Welcome back to the channel. This is our second major movement map lesson on the Kinetic whip model that modern day goats use to execute their backhands. And the focus today will be on showing you my innovation, I think, the Hammer Whip Backhand technique. And what is that essentially? Well, it's essentially trying to deal with the restriction of on the one-handers as we pull back and we have to use the throat of the racket to take the racket back with our non-hitting hand, and to move that hand down to the end of the racket like two-handers use. And now suddenly we have a lot more space, width, and depth to execute our backhand stroke. As I said in the last lesson, I just stumbled on this technique after really years of frustrating attempts to copy all the top goats with their hand on the racket take back here. And as I said, I made progress, and I'll show that to you. But this technique, which I only discovered really in the last month, I've been working on, and it continues to improve my backhand tremendously, and that's what I'm excited to share with you today. Before we get into the details of my hammer whip technique, I want to share again the overall context for what I'm presenting on this channel and in this lesson. So I want to take you through sort of a high-level perspective again, and then we'll get down to the details. First, I want to start off with what's the overall goal of this channel, and it's really to make playing tennis at a higher level easier. And as I've told you a few times, I've subscribed to over 60 tennis and sports instruction channels over the last several years, and it's been great for me. I've learned a tremendous amount, but it can be frustrating because it takes many months and sometimes even years of watching a channel before you get to the essence of what the channel is presenting and its value to you as the viewer. And I don't want you to have to wait months to get that. I'm gonna sort of give it to you right now and cut to the chase. So how am I trying to make playing higher level tennis easier for you? Well, we'll be talking about my recommendation that you spend about 15 minutes a day just practicing your swing. And before we get into those details, I wanna try to clarify what's the difference between what I'm presenting and what you may see in most other tennis instruction channels. So there are two critical moments in this swing, and we'll focus on the backhand since we're in the backhand series. Is once we take the racket back in some fashion, however you do it now or you do it in the future, there's gonna be a point where the racket gets as far back as it's going to go, and then we're gonna start the forward swing. So that's the first critical moment. And we have to ask what direction and how we're going to swing this racket. You know, the most basic question, where do I go from here? And the second most critical moment is when we start to approach contact. What direction do we swing? This is, again, nothing more critical. And we'll see in a second what traditional tennis recommends. What traditional tennis instructors recommend, their movement map, if you will, on this two critical moments of the swing is that you essentially swing straight. The target is straight ahead of me, facing the camera here. I've taken the racket back. What do I do to the start? Well, I start to swing straight. I bring the butt of the racket towards the target and the ball coming in. And then what do I do when I start to get out here and just about ready to get into making contact? What do? I should swing straight. And when I make contact, what should I do? I should extend straight through the target. Straight, straight, straight. This is the movement map of traditional tennis. And as I've said throughout the series, forehand and backhand is, this isn't, I wouldn't say it's wrong, it's just not modern good advice. This is the way tennis used to be played in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. Sure, Sampras and Agassi developed a little bit different kind of swing, but they were still dominated by this linear, straight ahead model of swinging. But after the Roger Federer and the Big Three came in the 2000s, that model was vastly improved, and that's the model that I'm trying to give you that's going to make tennis a lot easier to play at a higher level. So what do we do in the new GOAT model, modern GOAT model, once we've taken the racket back as far as we can and we're going to start our forward swing on the backhand side anyway, and our orientation is going to be not at the target of our body but out to the left? Well, the initial move out of the slot is not towards the target, it's to swing left, just initially. And then when we get into the critical moments where we're turning the racket into contact and through contact, what do? We swing right. So we're swinging on this arcing curve or spiral in the modern game. And once you learn this technique of swinging, it's going to be so much easier to play at a higher level. So how else am I trying to make it easier to play at a higher level? I'm recommending a technique and a way of learning that's based on science called deliberate practice. And you'll see that throughout this lesson and future lessons. And today we're going to be focused on an element of science called the center of mass. The center of mass, this racket, and how understanding this and how it works is going to help you make your tennis game soar. How else am I trying to make it easier for you? Well, I want to make it so that you can depend on the information. And when I was doing my years of research, I had to go to all these different throwing and swinging sports to see if what I thought was true was consistent with what the best teachers were teaching in these other throwing and swinging sports. And one of the reasons that it took me, as long as it did, too long, is that I was just wandering around the landscape kind of lost. One of the reasons it took me so long is that I didn't realize how embedded sort of my old style of thinking and swinging really was. This is the condition or default mode of swinging or moving that we have. We don't realize it. You ask someone what their swing model is, they go, hey man, I don't have any swing model, I just swing. But then you say, well, show me. Well, then I go like this. Well, then they do have a model in their minds. And this model is, because this racket is so light, tends to gravitate towards our conditioned way of moving, where we have something rigid in our hands and it's light. Then our basic way of moving is just to move it with our arm. That's how we manipulate and control the world in general, and so why should the tennis racket be any different? But we have to start thinking about this racket differently, and we have to adopt a much more athletic posture and way of thinking about moving this device. In terms of this conditioned way we have of moving and doing things, a good example is, learning to play the piano or typing. If we have no instruction or tutoring, we just go to our old instincts, which is, we can type with 2 fingers or play the piano with 2 fingers. So we have to learn in the skill level to overcome this conditioned way of moving. We learn to put 10 fingers on the typewriter, and we need to learn to move our fingers in sort of these uncomfortable ways at the beginning till they do become comfortable. Same with playing the piano, same with playing tennis. So why does science and all these experts say that deliberate practice is so much more effective than what people normally consider practice? Well, this is a very simple example. If you're practicing like most people practice, which is standing on the baseline hitting random shots, or you're playing socially with your friends in doubles usually, how many times are you really going to get a chance to hit a topspin backhand? Really only a few times. And you're going to be doing in the midst of people talking and chatter, and you're winning points, and that's your focus, of course. You're not going to be focused on the technique. But in 15 minutes of deliberate practice for the topspin backhand, you can swing hundreds of times and practice the swing hundreds of times and hit 100 balls in 15 minutes. And you can do it with full awareness and focus on exactly what you're trying to do in that particular moment. That's sort of the bedrock foundation of why deliberate practice is so much more efficient at improving people than random play or random practice. How else is this channel trying to help you play at a higher level? Well, we've all heard the tennis old pros say, you're only as good as your second serve. Or the first serve is the most important stroke in tennis because every point starts with a serve. And there is wisdom in both those sayings. But I think it's overlooking something even more fundamental, which is, given that a serve is a kind of swing, I would say that every point in tennis begins and ends with a swing. And that the best way to become a better tennis player is to focus on improving that fundamental truth, your swing. The other way I hope this channel will help you get to playing a higher level is giving you a way to do it. So I'm not recommending that people drop and quit their job and join a tennis academy, although I bet a few of you have thought about that. It's really not practical for most people, and nor is it necessarily advisable because it takes time for these improvements to take place. So I'm recommending that you allocate at least 15 minutes a day to practice, and you can practice this anywhere. Most of my improvement came off court in my office or in my living room, where I keep a racket by my couch and my desk. And so not restricted by time, money, or anything else. You just try to implement 15 minutes of deliberate focus and practice, and it will make a world of difference. And this is not just according to me, but again, according to the scientists and according to some of the world's best coaches. And I'll put a link in the notes section where you can see Peter Cowen, who's arguably the world's best golf coach, telling pros and students exactly what I'm telling you now. Then finally, how else am I, this channel, recommending that you start learning to play at a higher level is what I call get your butt up rule, encouraging you to get your butt up and try things, especially if you have a new idea. Usually most of my improvement came from when I was sitting on the couch watching television, and in the commercials I'd be thinking in the background about my tennis technique, and I'd have an idea, and after a while I realized that, well, this is an opportunity. I'd get my butt up and check it out for a couple minutes. That's deliberate practice, and it works wonders, but you have to actually get your butt up and experience the theory in your own body. You can't just view a YouTube video, even mine, and expect really to improve that much. Watching is important, but getting up to your butt and doing it is just as important, if not more. Just a little bit more background on my Hammer Whip Backhand technique within the context of the Kinetic whip model that I'm teaching and what I think the GOATs are playing at. So there's just a basic understanding that, that this way we at a swing and move is going to be based on the kinetic chain, and that once we drop our weight into the ground, it starts to rebound up through the ground up, yes, moving up in faster and faster waves till it reaches our upper torso, into our shoulder complex, out through our arm, into the hand, and the rotation and power of the kinetic chain is transmitted into the handle of the racket and pulled around on this spiral. That's basically the kinetic whip model. And underlying the kinetic whip model are 3 or 4 principles that I want to go over before we get into that detail. And the first one being the center mass of the racket. Now, I have talked about the center mass of the racket before, and we're gonna do it again just to clarify some things that people are confused about and deepen your understanding and appreciation, I think, of this principle. So on any object, the center mass is the balance point in the object, and this is what scientists study when they're really looking at how these things move in motion. They often focus on the center of balance. So the center mass, I should say, of the racket. So in a tennis racket, most of the weight is in the head here, handle lighter, so the balance point is about 2/3 of the way up from the handle. The reason this is important is that motion and physics science has discovered that the center of mass tends to line up behind a pulling action. As you see in the background here, I have a truck pulling a trailer around the curve. Now, as long as the truck doesn't make too abrupt a turn, this trailer will just track along behind it in this curving path around the corner. Now, this is exactly what should happen in a good tennis swing on the backhand side, is that if we have a pulling action as we start our forward swing and throughout our swing, we have a pulling force, this racket head is going to line up behind our pulling hand. So if we're pulling out here to the left, then the racket head will line up behind it. And why is that important? Well, one of the big problems with recreational play and earlier generations of play was that here I have a nice lag angle in between my forearm and the racket that I can use later on to release and get a lot of speed. But what happens with most recreational players, instead of a pulling action, they have a levering action on the racket handle. And then you see that the racket head swings out on the swing circle too early. And now the racket and the racket head and my arm are lined up. Among other things, this means that as I swing forward, this racket head can only go as fast as my arm and hand, which is about 20 miles an hour, which is way, way slower than the modern players are playing. So the significance is that from the slot, as you can see in the Wawrinka slide here, where he's in the slot and has this dramatic angle between his forearm and racket, that he can start to swing and this angle is preserved until we have to change that. But we don't want to change that. We want that lined up behind and pulling behind us till we need to swing it around. Now, why else is the center mass of the racket important to understand? Is that it will help us understand that we don't have to exert a leveraging, pushing force on the racket handle here to get the racket to come around and square to contact, which is how almost all recreational players and players of old swung. That this center of mass will tend to want to have this head rotate around it. And we'll show you some videos and other things in a few moments about that. So there's a automatic squaring force built into the center of mass construction of the tennis racket. And so if we throw this out on the swing circle on edge, like I've been talking about on the forehand and the backhand side, this head will want to come on its own, rotate around and square to contact just about perfectly if we do everything right. The other key concept to understand behind the kinetic whip model is this idea of angular momentum and speed. And I gave you the analogy last lesson about how we can think of this racket as, you know, the motorboat at the front here and the skier in the back. And if we're pulling in a straight line, like most players swing, and the boat's only going 20 miles an hour, then this racket head can only go 20 miles an hour. But as you see in the slide in the background, if the boat here starts to pivot and turn around the corner, which is what it should be doing, then this racket head, the skier, is swung out on the swing arc and accelerates around this curve 3 or 4 times the speed of this handle. So this accounts for the tremendous amount more speed, 3 to 4 times what players are getting on their topspin backhand and forehand than they used to, because they are swinging on this curving path that I'm talking about. And the last major concept that lies in an understanding of this kinetic whip model is just the whole idea of swinging being a kind of throwing action. And now we'll sort of go into a video that incorporates all these concepts and tries to show you how that works. So last week we talked about the frisbee throwing action, and I've been saying all along that swinging is a form of throwing. So I just wanted to show you in a series of throws and swings how similar they are. So if the target is that swing set out there, our orientation is similar in throwing and swinging, especially on the backhand side. We're going to orient more out here to the left, 60 degrees from the target. Why? Because we want to throw with our scap, at least our back scap, to the target to build up this coiling momentum and energy. So in a throwing action, we have a shift of weight to the backside, the trail side. We have a wind up of some kind, a coiling of the arm, hand, and wrist. And when we go to throw it, we have a sinking where we're recentering and moving our weight into our lead side, followed by the release, which is a free release of the racket or the frisbee in this case. And we're releasing on a circle where our timing is such that as we release out here, the object is going to direct the throwing object to down our target line. But we don't throw at the target, and nor do we send our hand or butt of the racket towards the target in a good throwing, swinging action. So in slow motion, it might look like this. So we said earlier that every object has a center mass, and that's the balance point. And this is what scientists study when they're studying the motion of objects. And so the balance point in a tennis racket is, well, most of the weight of the tennis racket is 2/3 of the way up. So once we've taken the racket back and dropped it in some form of slot of some kind, and if the target is straight out here where the camera is directed, almost all traditional tennis coaches will tell you that, well, the very first thing you should do is turn this butt of the racket towards the target, or you should throw your hand towards the target, and you should do this as aggressively and as quickly as possible to build up speed. And then when you get somewhere out here close to contact, then you should be loose and sort of let this racket head flap closed, square closed, and hit the ball as hard as you can. Something like that. But this is contrary to, this is working against the laws of physics and the laws of good swinging. Because when we get to the slot here, we don't want to turn and pivot the racket towards the target, because as you can see, as I apply leverage to do that, the racket head immediately starts to swing out. And once we get out early on the swing circle and the racket head and our arms are aligned like this, then the fastest we can swing this racket head is the same speed we can swing our hand, which is about 20 miles an hour. And I'll provide a link that shows how John McEnroe was still doing this and used to do it. He used to be the best player in the world in the 80s, but that model became surpassed in the future. So instead, with our understanding of physics and the center of mass, and the fact that the center of mass lines up behind the pulling action, we want a building momentum action out to the left of the target here initially, because we're going to be throwing in a swing circle or a spiral, if you'd be more exact. So we don't want to pivot out and throw the racket head out too soon. In baseball, they call this casting, in golf as well. It's a sure sign of a swing problem coming. So we want, as we pull out to the left here, we want this racket head lined up behind the pulling hand. And this is what you see in all modern great swingers. The racket head lined up behind the hand, not out here. So what happens how does the racket ever get squared? Well, again, the center of mass helps us if we allow it to help us. Because as we get to the turn of the swing, the pivot of the body and everything else towards the target, then other laws of physics take over on the center of mass. Now, the centrifugal force of our swinging, rotating action sends the racket head out on the swing circle and accelerates it around on its own. We don't have to apply leverage and pushing action to get the racket to come around and square. And we can swing as fast as we want, and the squaring action will happen almost automatically, perfectly, if everything else is right on with our body. So this force, the center of mass, and how it wants to rotate the head around the center of mass, is illustrated as we throw and release. So we're not putting any leverage on the racket. We're throwing it around the swing circle and releasing it out of our hand freely. So we have no contact with the racket as a release, and you'll see that the center mass is still in operation, rotating the head around. And that's the significance of this next slow motion footage of me throwing this racket on edge. In terms of batting, using the bat, we have a similar situation where the balance point is up here towards the head, 3/4 of the way up from the handle, and that's our center of mass. So, slow motion throw, we do the same thing. We're orienting not towards the target, but out 60 degrees to the left with a release that's going to bring it around towards the target. Golf club, same thing. We have a device that has a center of mass that's about 3/4 of the way up from the handle. That's the balance point. And we're going to see the club rotate around the center of mass just as it wants to kick to the outside as we throw it out on the swing circle. So what you should take away from these little throwing and swinging exercises, one, the basic functionality, the underlying biomechanics of throwing a frisbee, throwing a racket, golf club, or bat are very similar. Weight shift back, sinking, recentering, free release, all these are same. Even on the angle of the frisbee throw is probably up 40% into the air for a long throw, much like the racket is up 25 or 30% vertical through the contact zone. Two, that in all good swinging and throwing, the body is the main driver and leader of the action. They have a saying that where the body goes and the arms follow. So that's true in all throwing at a high level, all throwing and swinging sports, is the body is the main engine and the arms come lagging and releasing afterwards. And three, you need a certain amount of relaxation in your body in order to execute the sequencing of these actions, the kinetic chain, and the timing of the release. So relaxation becomes a key part of athletic throwing and swinging. So you've heard me say several times throughout the whole series on the forehand and now on the backhand that we don't want a levering or pushing action on the racket to square it to contact. We want a pulling action of the body. But it occurred to me that people really don't understand what this pushing and levering action is because, well, it's just kind of our default movement map. We've lost sort of awareness and consciousness of it. Well, if this were the head of the racket, this alignment stick with this black tip, and I wanted to, and this is the contact point, and I want to bring this head around to try to square it, well, I would be pushing and levering on the pressure on the handle down here where I'm holding it. And you can see the bend in the racket, and that's going to cause this head to come around and square. So this levering, pushing action through mostly an arm, elbow, wrist, hand force is the levering, pushing action that we should be trying to avoid. So someone could ask quite rightly, so Kim, how, if we're not going to use that action, how do we get this racket head to come around and square up at contact? And so that's the completely different way of swinging that I'm recommending that you learn. It is done through a pulling force, and the leverage is down here at the bottom of the racket with grip with a couple or 2, 3 fingers. And we're using our body, major muscles of our body, to pull through the handle. There's a pulling action so that this racket lines up behind our pulling hand in the slot. And only as we start to turn into contact, the other physics take over and the pulling force on the racket is not enough to keep it in line. Then we have centrifugal force with the outward swing of the racket head. And this is where we get 60% of our speed in all swinging sports, golf, tennis, and baseball. So this is just part of physics. And if we don't interfere with it and we throw it on edge, then we also get a nice, steady, stable plane of this racket face as it comes into contact. No wobbles and deviations, no rollovers, and all the other issues that we have with an unsteady levering action in our arm. That's why it's so critical to learn this pulling action. And now we'll just play a Wawrinka topspin backhand shot from the rear, and Djokovic from the rear, 2 goats, single-handed, two-handed, with the tracking on for the hand path and the racket path. And so you can see clearly for yourself this circular spiral path that they're on. And now you can have, I think, a better appreciation for how this is quite different than this linear pulling through kind of motion. The last point to make about all these laws of physics and principles that underlie the kinetic whip model, and it basically puts Sir Isaac Newton as your tennis coach, because now you're working with the laws of physics that he outlined. And maybe it sounds like a crazy idea, but really tennis began, in England in the 16th century. It was more like squash. But Sir Isaac Newton was one of the intellectuals and noble who could have been playing tennis at that time. And here you see a picture of the world's oldest tennis court in Scotland. And so there's nothing in the historical record that said Isaac Newton was a tennis player, but there's nothing to say that he wasn't either. So I prefer that he did play, and probably knew all the geometry angles of the court, don't you think? Now we'll go through the movement map of my hammer whip technique, but I want to make it consistent with the sort of the phases of the stroke that you're used to seeing from the best single-handed and double-handed players. But first thing we're going to talk about is the grip again. And last week I said, just like on the forehand, we're better off with a grip on the forehand side of Western or semi-Western that 90% of the pro players use now, because it orients the racket face to closed at contact, and it's going to encourage us for the right looping kind of swing that we'll need, a spiral swing, to make effective contact. And I said that we want our little fingers down here, the gripping fingers, to be in control of the racket. And there's, a lot of different reasons for this, and we won't go into all of them. But I just want you to get sort of the big picture, is that on the backhand side, most players, have a Eastern forehand grip or continental grip, where their knuckles are sort of oriented over here. And last week I was recommending that at least you get to an Eastern backhand grip where your pad of your index fingers on the top bevel. But we also see some great topspin backhand players on the single-handed side, Hannon, Gasquet. They're even having a more close racket face. And this hammer whip technique will help you get to that, and we'll talk about it in a second. But the other thing about the traditional grip in the palm of the hand in a Eastern forehand or continental grip is that it's consistent with an idea of swinging with a leveraging action. And this other kind of grip, with it just at the end of the racket, and I only use two fingers now at the end of the racket and have this third finger sort of wrapped around, so I'm even further down. I can control everything with these two little fingers, not my littlest finger, but the two other ones. And so instead of thinking about this grip as the foundation for a levering action, you think of it as just a pivot point here at the end of the racket, and that we're swinging this pivot point out and around freely, and it's moving and squaring up on its own. And this is a vastly different conception of the swing, and it starts right from the beginning with the grip and having a more closed racket face, because again, we want to have a vertical path through contact much higher, 25 to 30% through contact, than most recreational players think about contact on a topspin. They're still kind of going like this, at best, or trying to roll over in this ratcheting sort of way we'll get into. And with the grip as at the very end of the racket as a pivot point in the circling action, this moves completely freely on its own, and it moves so much faster and so much more consistent as it moves through space. The other thing this grip does is starts to help us conceive of our swing as part of the overall kinetic chain, just the end of it. So the kinetic chain builds energy from the ground up in successive waves and passes energy from one segment to another. And it has to do it with a great deal of integration and fine sequencing, so we don't have stalls and gaps and energy leaks as it moves up our chain. And that is also true once it gets to the shoulder complex, the arm, hand, racket, and handle. This all becomes the end of the kinetic chain and still works the same way, that things are moving and rotating on their own and accelerating all the way out to the fingers in the hand and the racket here. And if we do it right and we're relaxed enough and we were integrated enough, all this flows in a highly sequenced, integrated manner to, a blazing fast release that's much more consistent than the old style. So in good throwing instruction, they call this process a continuous loop of energy, this rising of the energy through our body out to our arm, out to the throwing object, a continuous loop of energy. And we'll have some exercises in the how-to section of how to achieve that with this new grip and this new style of swinging. So again, back to the hammer whip and technique, which I'm saying helps solve this critical problem of being so cramped in the takeback with the hand on the throat. And if we move our hands down like two-handers do and do the takeback with these two hands down here at the handle, that we have so much more width and depth in our swing. But before we sort of get too much into this, I want to take on this issue of people saying, well, if the ideal take-back position is what I'm showing you, like Nadal or Djokovic, or in the hammer whip like I'm showing you, I want to just start the swing there. Then you eliminate a lot of complexity, and then you just would go from there. So that's fine, and a lot of people out on the serve, they want to start here. And those are fine for drills, because as we break down the pieces of the swing, sometimes we want to start in that position or start in this position. But in the final analysis, we don't want to just force our body into a given position. It's very static and non-dynamic, inconsistent with the kinetic continuous loop of energy idea, is that we want to flow into these positions and load dynamically our body and let it flow out dynamically. That's what we're looking for. So in terms of the movement map for the hammer whip technique, it has all the elements of a good take back and drop into the slot for the single-handed and two-handed. So for the single traditional hander, and he's dropping into the slot, we have a coil and side bend. So we have room behind us to drop the racket head into that slotted position. And in dropping here, we also are creating a stretch across our back, arm, chest, so that we're coiled now as we drop into this. And there's even an element of dropping our momentum and weight shift starting into our lead side, because we want to be centered before we start the maximum part of our rotation of our swing. So on the hammer take back, it's essentially no different, except we're working with a lot more control of the racket. We have it in our fingers, and you can start with your lead hand on an Eastern forehand, or if you, and I recommend that we'll try this, is that if you control the racket here as you start to grip with your non-hitting hand, you can sort of roll the racket strings face down here, and now you can put your pad of your index finger on the sixth bevel on the other side. So now when I do that, you can see my racket strings are facing almost straight down, closing the racket face even more, like you see Nadal do especially. So on the backhand take back, we have a lot more width. We're not having the problem on the forehand side of taking it high over our shoulder, is that we can sort of turn on a much more horizontal level one way or the other, and even start very low like Justine Henin used to do, with a racket and the straight arm way down here. And so we'll go over the details of this in the how-to section, but I'm just showing you the basics now. So we have a even more closed grip in our fingers, and we have control of this racket with our fingers of our hand, and we're drawing the racket back. And for now, we'll sort of take the Nadal take back with the strings flat, very flat, and we're going to drop into the slot with the same motion. That's no different with the hammer whip technique than any other technique, except now my hands and racket are beginning to be extended far back behind me, but I still have control of this, more control with these two hands and the fingers than I ever did back here with this action. So everything else is pretty much the same, except a lot more width and depth, but we want the same coiling and bending and starting of recentering. The second phase is sort of when we are moving forward out of the slot, and here again, the backhand is the mirror of the forehand technique. So for those of you who remember, is we're starting in the slot on the forehand side. This will be the target out here. So I'm starting out here, and again, we want the racket head to be following our pulling hand, not shooting out here too soon. So one of the ways that the pros do this is that they have this master move I call, where on the forehand side, the forearm supinates and the shoulder lays back. So we want to keep this lagging and behind our pulling action. Well, the same thing on the forehand, except slightly different movements, right? So now we're pulling out to the left, and we want to keep this racket lined up so the lead shoulder goes into a little bit of an external rotation here. No, excuse me, internal rotation here, just like you see Nadal and doing in this close-up. So he's turning and angling the back down, and the hand and forearm are, rotating this way back a little bit more. So he's twisting back as he starts forward, twisting back as he starts forward. This is the master move on the backhand side. And with two hands for the one-hander, now we can, I think, make more effective use of this elbow and the back scap here. Now we can use this to pull back and load our coiling more and more easily than we can when the racket is held by the throat here. And with the greater control of two hands, as we come out and into the forward part of the swing, we can lower the racket head if we choose to much more easily with these two-handed grip. And this is going to position the racket for this sharply vertical rise as we get to the turn of the swing. So there's another advantage of having two-handed control of this one-handed shot. The final thing to note, we've already discussed it, about this master move in this initial movement, is that it preserves the angle that we've created between our forearm and racket in the slot. This is the release of this angle is going to give us most of the speed in our swing. So we don't want to have the racket shoot out here too soon and move slowly around our body. We want, as we move along, we want to keep this angle as much as we can, while still keeping our swing fluid, of course. So the master move on the backhand side and the layback and the scap retraction all keep and help preserve this angle as we start out on the swing circle. So now if the target's out here and I'm demonstrating the hammer whip, as we move out on the swing circle further, we get to the point where our body is making its final pivot towards the target. Not our arm yet, but our body. And this is what we call the turn of the swing. So now basically the racket butt has been sort of tracking, out here to the left of the target here. And as we get to the turn of the swing, you see the sharp pivot of the butt of the racket going from left to right on the backhand. A sharp turn, just like that ski boat had a sharp turn. And what this does is it accelerates the racket around the swing circle 3 or 4 times the speed of the hand. And it also squares the racket face to contact. So this sharp turn and the pulling up as we make this turn creates this sharply vertical path that we want through contact for a topspin. Of course, on the hammer whip, as we start to release from the merging from the slot, at least the way I do it now, is just start to release that hand. But you could very easily keep the hand on longer if that's gonna give you what you want out of the swing, or just keep your hand on it all together and you could start to create a two-handed swing. Don't try to go there right yet. So we're releasing the non-hitting hand as we move out of the slot, but all the momentum and direction and everything that we need is already built into this by that point. Of course, as we let the racket swing up into contact, we want contact to be with the racket face slightly closed because we're swinging on this sharply vertical path. If we came into it perpendicular, like so many coaches recommend, we're going to shoot the ball over the baseline. It's just going to go sky high. So we need a closed racket face. And again, that's why if you experiment around, which we'll do with even a more closed grip on this hammer whip background, you can really fling this ahead of you without any concern about not squaring up properly and getting the ball into the court. So you'll meet contact with a more closed racket face, more speed, and more consistency, easier. Yes, you can have a slightly closed and still do all this, but with, just like on the forehand, with a Western or semi-Western, more closed racket face, it's just easier to produce the kind of topspin stroke that we want. And finally, in the last phase of the swing, the follow through, for the single-handeder, as I said last week, you have a larger swing radius because your arm can extend out freely and release freely. As you can see Wawrinka here in the background. And this racket tends to swing around like this on the swing circle, and then the swing's over. For the two-hander, keeping two hands through contact, that swing radius is shorter. And of course, in the follow through, both hands are going to bring the racket back up closer to the body over the shoulder like you see Djokovic do. So you can see that the phases of the swing, the take back, the from the slot, contact, follow through, aren't that much different with the hammer whip. But you have so much more freedom and width and depth and speed and control on your stroke, I think, than you can with the old technique. I know many of you won't agree with that and won't believe it, but I hope that you will stick with us enough to try it out a little bit for yourself. We're now in the deliberate practice, the how-to section of the lesson. And as usual, I want to remind you to do these exercises to make sure that you're healthy and fit enough to do so. And I'll have the checklist that I'll read here in the background. Is don't do these exercises if you're injured or sore. Stop the exercise immediately if you feel any pain or soreness. Do all the exercises in athletic posture, because Remember, our lower spine only rotates 5 degrees, but our upper thoracic and cervical spine rotates 45 to 50 degrees. So we have to be in a tilted posture to access that rotation without hurting ourselves. And fourth, start these programs slowly, work your way into it, get warmed up. Don't overdo things until you are a little bit more assured of the movement before you go into the faster reps. Before we go into the details of the hammer whip technique, I want to start with a few quotes to keep you fired up and inspired about doing deliberate practice. The first one is by Michael Jordan, where he says, "You can practice shooting 8 hours a day, but if your technique is wrong, then all you become is very good at shooting the wrong way. Get the fundamentals down and the level of everything you do will rise." That's so much about how we move through all these movements very precisely. And the second quote is from the coaches of Athletic Golf Motion, one of the top golfing instruction sites on YouTube. And their advice, and they've said it many times, is the best drill is to do a movement correctly, slowly, which is the way we always begin these deliberate practice exercises. So you don't have to wait, now that you understand sort of how the progression of these deliberate practice principles apply. You don't have to wait for me to give you all the individual lessons that you might want to be practicing. You can invent things on your own, and you should invent things on your own. In terms of actually getting out and doing these exercises, let me remind you of the value of this portable tripod with a cell phone holder here. You can fold it up and put it in your bag wherever you go. With this, you can take my videos or anyone else's videos you want to practice, and you can do it in your living room, your bedroom, garage, on the court, or in your backyard. So this portable lesson environment, and one where you're not trying to remember a video you watched 3 days ago and miss a lot of the key details and movements. You can keep on top of it by following along with your cell phone if you have one of these holders. And I'll put a link in the video in the notes where you can buy one that costs about $20. The first exercise on the hammer whip is just finding the best hammer whip grip. Last week I said, try to place the pad of your index finger on the first bevel. That's the Eastern forehand that a lot of players use, and that's fine. But today I'd like you to try a little bit more, quote, extreme grip, to semi-Western and Western. So semi-Western would be putting the pad on the 7th bevel before you get to the top, and Western would be on the side panel, the 6th bevel. So how do we do this? So if you just hold the racket up here vertically, again, Eastern would be putting the pad on the top bevel. But if you just rotate the racket down where the strings are facing flat, then it's very comfortable to put your pad of your finger on that 6th bevel, the Western grip. And now, if I let go, you can see how closed that racket face is. This is much more like a Nadal type backhand that I'll have you work through today. And again, once you feel this, it feels very strange. And if you do it with 2 hands, of course, it's going to feel even stranger and more uncomfortable. And that's another principle of deliberate practice, is that the researchers have found that we learn fastest when we're working slightly out of our comfort zone. Not in our comfort zone, but slightly out of it. Now this grip for a one-hander is going to feel probably more than a little uncomfortable. And that's why we're doing this first exercise, sort of get you warmed up a little bit more. So this is we're just feeling this grip and placing our fingers on the pad on the 6th or the 7th bevel. It doesn't really matter there, just make it a little bit more closed. We're going to grip and control the racket with the bottom 3 fingers. I only use 2 now, and I feel that that's fine, but you can use 3 if you want. And the other one, I don't care where you place it as long as the grip is in the fingers. And so that you're controlling, and I want you to move this racket head around and just feel that you can do a lot of control and manipulation just with your wrists and your forearms. So this kind of gives you that Nadal ability to drop that racket head down here when we get to the back area. So the first thing is just to spend a minute finding this grip, manipulating the racket around, waving it around, and just sort of take it back here a little bit wide, like Nadal might. We'll go into this a little bit more, but I'm just trying to get you to feel, and then I want you to actually look back here behind you, see how far that racket is. See if you have enough depth and width in it, or you just drop it right here. See if you can extend it out a little bit and get a little bit comfortable with this and have the racket head a little slightly above the hands back here. So I'll pause the video for you to do a couple minutes of warm up on this. In this next exercise, using your new, more Western Hammer Whip grip and having the racket sort of cocked up here like the picture of Nadal has. And so we're going to sort of use Nadal as our basic model in the take back. So we're going to have the racket sort of cocked up 45 degrees or so, 50 degrees up like this in our hands, and our arms are going to be extending away from our body right away. So we're creating width right away. Maybe even exaggerate this a little so it's even more pronounced than you see Nadal here. And so I want you to lead with your back elbow pulling back, keeping the racket head slightly in front of your hands, and just turn. And we're going to be turning and more orienting our shoulder 60 degrees to the left of the target over here. And then we're going to, as we turn back here, I want you to turn not just your arms, but your chest back as well. So there's going to be some rotation in the chest back here, and then extend it back with the racket strings down as you see Nadal. Racket head slightly above the hands. And, so from here, I just want you to turn, extend, and pause there. Again, study your position, look back, feel your way through it. See if you can get extra width back here, extra depth back here, maybe a little bit of stretch in your arms so they're not folded in around you. And do 10 slow motion Nadal takebacks, hammer whip style. So in the next exercise, again, we're going to do these all in slow motion. And if this is the target, I'm going to give you this orientation now on the hit. So I'm turned, there's the target, turn 60 degrees to the left, my shoulders. So I'm facing with my back scap, and I'm going to have a nice wide, high, semi-high take back, and then drop my arms down, strings flat to the ground, racket head slightly above my hands. And we're gonna drop into the slot like Nadal. So we're gonna have that side bending motion, letting the arms fold back, the racket fold back into a deeper space behind us, lowering their hands and racket like you see Nadal does. And we're going to sink and have some momentum going into our lead side. Not total, but some. So we're getting ready to drive out of this slot and start the rotation forward. But I just want you to do from the ready position. This would be facing. We're going to turn, wide swing, depth, sink and coil. We get ready to come out of the slot. So 10 slow motion pausing between each to see if you can get more width and depth as you go along. I'll pause the video. Again, the target's here, but now we're at the stage where we're into the forward swing, so here's where the hammer whip technique is really coming into play besides the traditional two-hander take back. So target's here, turning 60 degrees, wide take back with some chest rotation back, and trying to get extension and depth back here, control of the racket with our grip, right? Athletic posture. And we're going to be stepping more into our lead side coming out. But as we step, we're going to do that pull back. I'm not going to get into any details here. Pull back of the shoulder and laying back more of the arms and racket as we move forward. So we're getting more stretch through our back and our chest. Again, we're doing all this in slow motion right now. And so we're going to feel the hips starting to unwind first and the momentum transferring to our lower side first and the stretch in our upper torso. But then as the hips start to finally rotate more fully and turn, then the torso and the chest is going to turn. We want to try to keep this arm close to our chest initially. We don't want it flying out right away. Let the body turn and the arm compress against the chest. And then as we get to the final turn of the body, yes, then you're gonna let the throwing action on edge that we talked about, let that develop on its own and just go through that slowly. So, of course, we're gonna release in the hammer whip as we get down and start forward. There's no specific moment you can do it. You just go to feel that you don't need this hand any longer, and you can just let the lead arm go and do its normal kind of swinging. Again, if you feel like you want to continue the non-hitting hand on a little longer, that's fine. But at some point in the hammer whip, you were dropping our non-hitting hand and letting the hitting arm extend in a traditional one-handed follow through and release. So I'll pause the video for 10 hammer whip slow motion swings. And our last off-court drill, as it normally is to try to ramp up the speed, the integration, the sequencing. So I want you to do 10 fast swings, not hitting balls yet, but using the hammer whip technique. Targets here, so we're going to be moving 45 degrees, 60 degrees out to the left, wide turn with our chest leading and our arms leading, the back elbow pulling, racket above our hands, but then dropping down, extending back. We're sinking and coiling, side bending into our slot. And of course, we're going to now let these things unwind and speed up, you know, the hip motion, the hip unwinding, then the upper torso, and then the arms lagging, and then the faster whipping release. So 10 fast hammer whip swings. Now I want you to take this on court, and we'll pretend we're on court now, and you have your training partner, or your ball machine, or your wall, and you're working on your new hammer whip technique, or you're trying it anyway. And so I want your partner to toss you nice, high, slow bouncing balls to your backhand where you don't have to move much. And you're gonna feel right away as you put on the grip, this is still gonna feel very strange to you. And probably the first thing you're gonna say is, well, there's no way I can take my arms all the way back here like Nadal does. And it just feels too weird, too awkward. The ball will come and I won't be ready to make contact. And that's understandable, you know, this is totally new. But it doesn't take that long to sort of get used to this. And so, but mentally, I want you to think about that, you know, you're really gonna move much more quickly into this take back than you usually do your normal single-handed take back of whatever it is. You do have to move quicker and you have to prepare quicker to do these techniques. And that's a good thing. And I want you to do 10 medium speed cross topspin hits with a hammer whip. And the first couple could be complete disasters. You may, as I did, hit it into the ground. You didn't even get it to the net. But because we're working with such a closed face racket now for maybe the first time, and you're used to swinging on a much more level horizontal plane, that's not going to change instantly. So with a very closed grip and a more horizontal swing path, the ball is going to be driven into the net low. You make some bad mistakes. But even one or two, after you pause, you can think about that. If the ball goes down into the net, it's like, well, I really have to get my arms going up much, much higher than I ever have done before, and I'm not comfortable with. That's fine. And you'll find, I think, by the 9th or 10th medium speed hit, that indeed you can, you can get that vertical path more, and you can get that ball going over the net with some topspin. So you're pausing each time, evaluating how you're hitting it, trying to get more and more topspin. So I'll pause the video for 10 medium speed topspin hits. And then finally, we want to do 10 fast hammer whip backhands cross court. Partner tights it nice and high and slow. And you're trying to smooth out and integrate all these movements, not forgetting the athletic posture, not forgetting the grip, not forgetting the dip and rise out of the slot, and trying to let this thing come together in a flowing way so that you feel the body turning and the arms lagging and the racket thrown on edge in that whipping motion. I'll pause the video. Now we've come to the conclusion of our hammer whip lesson for today, and I'll be referencing this technique as we go along, but we will be moving into the more traditional one and two-handed techniques in the future. But I do hope that this exercise has given you a little bit better understanding of the new feels and principles that we'll be incorporating into building a better topspin backhand. And for those of you who have kept up with your deliberate practice exercises in this series or with another instructor, you know, deliberate practice is the fastest way to improve. So if you've kept up, your tennis spiritual coach, Sir Isaac Newton, who's been teaching you how to work with the laws of physics rather than against them in your new swing, says bravo, and so do I. You're on the fastest way to improving. For those of you who have just been watching the videos and not doing the deliberate exercises, well, you know what I'm going to say. Get your butt up.